Hello everyone, I'm Sarah and I'm 15 years old. Last summer, I learned someone else's secret, and I haven't been able to sleep since. Today, I'll be sharing it with you. That day, Vanessa and I were riding bikes. Our town is small, and rarely does something interesting happen here, so a strange man in a white robe immediately caught our attention. He had moved into the empty house at the end of the street. We watched as he carefully lifted each of the many boxes of things and brought them into the house. He seemed to be whispering something to them. Suddenly, he glared right at us. He had such an unpleasant and ominous look that it chilled me to the bone. We quickly left and decided to forget about it. I would have forgotten about him completely had it not been for Vanessa. She ran to my house and told me that she had driven past the mad scientist's house and heard strange noises. They were coming from the basement, so she looked out the window and saw that he was doing something terrible. She convinced me that we needed to figure out what was going on. Within minutes, we were at his basement window. It seemed that the mad scientist had been conducting some experiments in his basement. There were medical instruments and flasks on the table, just like in a secret laboratory, and the shelves were full of strange containers. We weren't expecting to see him and were terrified. I swore I would never even come close to the mad scientist's house again. But that night, I received a message from Vanessa. She said she wanted to get into the basement when the mad scientist wasn't home. I told her it was a stupid and dangerous idea, but Vanessa was determined and I couldn't let her go alone. I agreed to go, but on the condition that I got to stay outside and keep watch. The house had been empty for many years. When we were 13, we loved playing spies and often made our way over there. So we knew how to open the basement door. Vanessa had figured out that the mad scientist would go somewhere at the same time every day. We arrived in advance and waited. If only we had known then that everything would happen quite differently from what we had planned. This was our chance. Vanessa began opening the basement door, and I made sure that no one was watching us. When she finally got it open, Vanessa was afraid to go inside. She suggested that we abandon the scheme and go home. As always, she had changed her mind at the very last second. Then what was the point of this whole thing? I was very angry with her and told her to stay outside. I would do it myself. The basement was incredibly dark. I turned on the flashlight on my phone. The signal was weak, and I doubted whether Vanessa would be able to reach me when the scientist returned. I had to act quickly. And then I saw something that I still have nightmares about. It was a real secret laboratory. All over the walls were diagrams of the human body and various organs. It all looked so sinister. Some of the drawings were red, and I decided to touch them. I got paint on my hand. I hoped it was paint. There were various instruments on the tables, as if I were in an underground operating room, and it smelled very strange. I can't quite explain the sweet odor, but I still smell it when I remember that basement. But the most unspeakable things were on the shelves. There were transparent jars, and inside them were something like embryos. I couldn't quite figure out what species they were because they were so small, and there were so many. I felt sick and got away from them. Then I noticed a door. I remember how my knees were trembling, and my inner voice was telling me not to open it and get out of there as soon as possible. But I still pulled the handle. The door was locked. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't give. And then a light turned on. It was so bright that I was blinded for a few seconds. But once my eyes adjusted, I saw the big, frizzy head of the mad scientist right in front of my face. I was numb with horror. He started talking. His voice was old and creaky. He asked if I knew what happens to those who break into private property. I was silent. I was too scared to utter a word. My legs seemed petrified, and my heart seemed like it was about to jump out of my chest. He sat me on a wheelchair. There were straps on the armrests to immobilize the hands of the patient? Victim? I was so scared. The scientist locked the cellar door. I thought that I was never getting out of there now. He started walking towards me. I babbled that I would never do it again and begged him to let me go. His hands were hidden behind his back. He was holding something in them and was coming closer and closer. I cringed in my chair and he brought his clenched fist to my face and opened it. It was candy. Help yourself, he said. Take the candy and don't let me see you here again. Something like a smile appeared on his face. I took the candy but didn't dare put them in my mouth. I was still scared, but the scientist didn't seem so scary to me anymore. I decided to ask him what was in the jars. He said that they were animal embryos and that he needed them for research. I felt uneasy again. We talked. He suddenly became sad and said that he and his wife really wanted children, but they couldn't get pregnant. They lost each baby one by one, and then they divorced. There was too much grief in their lives. His voice began to tremble. He said he had started studying embryos to find the cause of the problem and save millions of other families. To do this, he had to get a job in an abortion clinic. It was unbearable for him to see people refusing to have children when he wasn't even able to do so. He was on the verge of tears, and I even felt sorry for him. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I asked him what was behind the locked door. He pretended not to understand what I meant, but I pointed to the door and asked him to open it for me. Then he got angry and shouted that if I opened the door, he would have to lock me in there forever. He leaned over me. His gaze horrified me. Then he said that he needed to take his medicine and it was time for me to leave. He opened the basement door. As I was leaving, he raised a finger to his lips. "Shh, don't tell anyone about this," he said. I was too scared to argue with him. Would you have tried to find out what was behind that door? I ran home. Vanessa was there. She ran to hug me and, in tears, told me that she had been trying to call me, but my number was not available. She was about to tell my parents everything. She started asking me about everything. I told her bluntly that everything was fine and nothing interesting had happened in there. The door had just slammed shut and I had to tinker with it. She asked if I had found anything in the basement. I saw how interested she was, so I decided to lie and said that there was just old junk. Since that day, I started having trouble sleeping because the secret of the scientist's basement was keeping me awake. I couldn't tell my parents anything and didn't want to tell Vanessa what had happened. I knew that she would do something stupid and get hurt. Maybe I was just lucky that Doc had let me go. She and I grew more and more distant after that incident. I really wanted to forget about everything I had seen there, but I just couldn't. Life after the incident seemed boring to me, but after a few months, something unfortunate happened which revealed the truth. The mad scientist had a heart attack. He had no one, so his body was discovered a few days later. They might not have found it at all if his absence at work had gone unnoticed. The cops found him in the basement, and although he had died of natural causes, the cops had to conduct a search of such a suspicious place. They opened the mysterious door and found 2,200 embryos! They say that some of them were human. There were also a bunch of scientists' research notes, which would make your hair stand on end. So that's what he was hiding. Terrible rumors about the scientist quickly spread around the city. The story began to develop ridiculous details, but I didn't believe it. I remembered my conversation with Doc. He had dreamt of having children and didn't want to hurt them. He said that it was all for a good cause. But could I really believe him? After all, I didn't know him at all. Maybe his experiments were so awful that they were unjustifiable. But maybe they were aimed at helping other people. I still couldn't decide. Was he on the side of good or evil? What do you think? Tell me in the comments. And that's it. Thanks for listening to my story.